is it that almost every other captain on the Grand Line has taught their crew Haki, but Luffy seems to care less? Think about it for a second. You have a captain who can coat his fists in invisible armor, knock people unconscious with a glance, and see the future. His crew, meanwhile, is out here getting thrown through walls by guys who are clearly weaker than their captain on his worst day. So, why hasn't he said anything? Why hasn't Monkey D. Luffy sat his crew down and said, hey, here's how you don't die? Why is Zoro out here figuring out Armament Haki basically on his own? Why did Usopp awaken Observation Haki mid-panic attack and Dressrosa with zero guidance? And perhaps, most importantly, does Luffy even know that he's supposed to be teaching them anything at all? Let's start with the most obvious explanation, the one that anyone who's watched more than 15 minutes of One Piece already knows in their bones. Luffy is not a teacher, he's not a mentor, he's barely a planner. This is a man who's announced his dream to a random kid he met that morning, jumped into danger with a treasure map he couldn't read, and regularly forgets what island he's supposed to be going to. Expecting Luffy to design a Haki curriculum for the Straw Hat Pirates is like expecting him to do their taxes. It's not like he doesn't care. It's the concept of sitting down and methodically transferring knowledge to another human being that's so fundamentally foreign to how Luffy operates that it might as well be spoken in a language he doesn't understand. Luffy learns by doing. He doesn't learn by being taught. He learns by getting his face caved in repeatedly until his body figures it out. That's literally how he awakened Second Gear, that's how he learned Gear 4, and that's how he unlocked Advanced Conqueror's Haki during the Kaido fights. Not because someone explained the mechanics to him, but because he got beaten half to death enough times that his body had no choice but to adapt or give up. So, when Luffy looks at his crewmates, he probably genuinely doesn't understand why they can't just do it. Why can't Nami just punch harder? Why can't Chopper just want it more? In Luffy's mind, the formula is simple. Need power, get power, have power. The immediate steps are a mystery to him too. This is actually backed up by one of the rare moments where Luffy does say something remotely instructional about Haki. On Rusukaina, during the 2-year time skip, he trained under Rayleigh, and even Rayleigh, a man who's literally the first mate of the Pirate King, a man who had decades of experience and a teaching brain, said that trying to explain Haki in detail is almost pointless. The fundamentals can be pointed at, but the actual development of Haki is internal. It's about strength of will, it's about spirit. You can tell someone to feel their spirit, but if their spirit isn't ready, nothing happens. Which means Luffy, who probably zoned out halfway through Rayleigh's explanation anyway, came away from that training with the rough understanding that Haki is just something you get when you're strong enough to get it. So, again, why teach? Now, here's where it gets a little more interesting, because there is actually a real in-world argument for why the stronger Straw Hats are developing Haki on their own without needing Luffy to say a word. Zoro, Sanji, and even Usopp and Jinbei are not rookies. They're being pushed to their absolute limits on a daily basis because they're sailing with a man whose enemies include emperors, admirals, and ancient mythological weapons. Extreme and constant mortal danger is, it turns out, a reasonably effective Haki training program. Every single one of them is leveling up simply by surviving. Luffy didn't teach Zoro Armament Haki. Zoro just kept fighting people who could kill him until his body figured it out, which is horrifying as a pedagogical philosophy, but also very on brand for the Grand Line. There's another reason that almost never gets talked about, and it might actually be the most Luffy reason of all. He genuinely doesn't think of himself as stronger than his crew in a way that would make teaching feel natural. This sounds insane given that Luffy is now a literal emperor of the sea, but follow the logic. Luffy has never once looked at his crewmates and thought, I am above these people. He doesn't see himself as the wise veteran dispensing wisdom to weaker subordinates. In his mind, Zoro is Zoro, monstrous, terrifying, the future's greatest swordsman, already operating on a level that Luffy respects completely. Sanji is Sanji, a fighter so dangerous that Luffy never once worried about him in a serious fight. Jinbei is a former warlord of the sea who's been sailing the Grand Line since before Luffy could spell it. In Luffy's head, these are not people who need his help. They're his crew precisely because they're already extraordinary. The idea that he would pull Zoro aside and say, let me show you something about Haki, probably feels to Luffy like walking up to Mihawk and offering tips on sword grip. Presumptuous, unnecessary, maybe a little rude. Luffy's respect for his crewmates is so complete and so unquestioning that it actively prevents him from ever positioning himself as their superior in any meaningful way, even in moments when he objectively is. He doesn't have a big brother energy, he doesn't have a sensei energy. He has the energy of someone who fully believes that the people beside him are going to figure it out, because look at them, how could they not? That unshakable faith is magnetic and infuriating in equal measure, and it means the Haki conversation never happens because in Luffy's heart, it doesn't need to. Compare this to other pirate crews in One Piece and the dynamic becomes even funnier. Whitebeard's commanders were all individually monstrous. Big Mom's children have Haki baked in from birth, partially because Big Mom is terrifying and partially because if you grow up in that house, developing a powerful will is basically a survival mechanism. Kaido literally screams at his subordinates until they awaken their abilities. These are all in their own deranged ways forms of leadership and mentorship. Luffy's method is to inspire his crew so hard that they independently become monsters because they refuse to be the weak link next to him. It's almost genius, it's definitely accidental. There's also the not-so-small matter of what Haki actually is for each person. Haki isn't a technique you copy. It isn't a move with a name and a hand seal. It's an extension of your own will, your own personality, your own fighting spirit. Luffy's Conqueror's Haki is terrifying because Luffy himself has that kind of spiritual presence that bends reality. His Observation Haki is tied to his emotional attunement to the people around him. His armament is tied to his absolute refusal to break. None of that translates into a lesson plan. Luffy can't teach Usopp to have Conqueror's presence because Usopp isn't built that way. But Usopp has something Luffy doesn't, which is the ability to keep fighting while being absolutely terrified. That's where his Observation Haki came from. It came from being Usopp, not from being anything Luffy said, which actually makes the whole situation weirdly beautiful if you squint at it. The Straw Hats aren't developing Haki because their captain walked them through it. They're developing Haki because sailing with Luffy has forced every single one of them to grow into stronger, more resolute versions of themselves. Nami navigates impossible seas and doesn't flinch. Robin keeps going despite having every reason to give up. Frankie builds weapons to protect people he loves. Chopper aims to cure every disease in the world. These are not small spirits. These are not timid ambitions. The Haki is coming, slowly in some cases, but it's coming, and it's entirely authentic to who they are. Luffy didn't hand it to him, he created the conditions for them to find it themselves. That said, let's be fair, there are moments where it would have been incredibly helpful for Luffy to say something, anything. During Wano, watching some of the crew struggle against enemies that Luffy himself could sneeze on, there's a part of every fan's brain that screams, "Luffy, buddy, say the words! Tell Nami about Observation Haki. She's right there!" But Luffy's off running toward the next explosion, and the lesson remains untaught. And Nami figures it out anyway using her cleverness and weather abilities, and somehow it all works out. It always works out. That's the Straw Hats' way. Luffy not teaching Haki is less a failure of captainship and more a feature of what kind of crew the Straw Hats actually are. They're not a military unit following a doctrine. They're not students at a martial arts dojo. They're a collection of individually extraordinary people who choose to follow a man whose greatest power is making everyone around him want to be better. Luffy leads by dreaming so loudly and so shamelessly that everyone nearby catches the fever. The Haki follows naturally. And honestly, if Luffy sat everyone down for a Haki seminar with a whiteboard and pointer, it would ruin everything. That's not the crew, that's not the dream. The dream is that one day, every single one of them gets their moment where their Haki explodes out of them, not because they were told how, but because they had no choice. Because they're Straw Hats, and Straw Hats don't quit. Luffy didn't teach them Haki, he taught them something harder to explain and infinitely more powerful. The rest was always going to take care of itself.